Welcome to the seasonal year. This is episode 1. Your biology hasn't changed for 10,000 years.
I'm Vanessa Corazon. Welcome to the seasonal year. Light drives biology, biology drives behavior. Welcome to the cycles of your life. If you're anything like me, you have called yourself inconsistent, flaky, and probably a variety of other bad words. We tend to do this when we don't keep operating at full tilt. So we get excited about a project or a plan, we start to implement it, and then anywhere between a few days to a few weeks later, we find ourselves berating ourselves and having to start all over again. But what if it's not about inconsistency? What if it's something more human, more biological, that has us motivated and moving at different speeds, and also sees us, what appears to be, fall off the track or fail at different points? And what if there's actually a rhythm to it? These are the questions that I asked myself nearly a decade ago when I started to track what I thought was changes within my hormones. I had 3 small children. I had been some variety of sleep deprived and in baby stages of my parenting journey, while also equally running a business. And I truly believed that my lack of willpower and discipline was a personality flaw. And so it sent me down a really interesting path, which is that I started to track what I thought was changes to my hormones, trying to figure out if I just needed a break or if I needed to somehow develop some new overnight level of discipline that would change the course of my life. And I'm really pleased to say that it was not the latter, where I had to force myself into a box, but it was rather something really quite interesting that I noticed that there was a rhythm and a pattern to these changes in quote unquote motivation. And so that's what I'm here to talk with you about, because if you have struggled with your own consistency, your own discipline, your own productivity, and you tend to go through cycles where you're blaming and shaming yourself, or you're forcing yourself to push through, which then contributes to burnout later down the line. And if you are secretly wondering if there's some productivity hack or some app or some new technique that you just haven't stumbled upon yet, that you just haven't figured out yet, that is going to solve all of your problems. But if you're interested not in just finding potentially a hack, but actually understanding that there is a mechanism behind this and there is a purpose behind this, and that it is not that you are some failed human being, but rather that you are a biological one. And as a biological one, you are actually fueled and powered by light. And I don't mean kind of the metaphysical version of light, but actual solar light. And the cycles of the sun and the moon actually power a lot more than what we're aware of. In New Age circles, we might talk about this in more of a spiritual context, but it's actually a biological one, and it comes down to not only circadian rhythm, but also seasonal light cycles, which is what this podcast is all about. So before we get started, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about me and my background. I am what we would commonly refer to as an astrologer, but I didn't start off that way. My primary focus was working in business. I had several businesses that started and failed well over the course of more than 20 years. But in the past decade, I've shifted my focus to astrology, not from a horoscopal perspective or a sun sign astrology perspective, but what it was originally guided to do and understood to do through millennia, which is that it is a timing device. Our ancestors tracked the sun and moon with great specificity. They built monuments to track this. Some of our oldest calendars that we have on record were actually to track not only eclipses, but also the position of the sun to mark the seasons and the position of the moon, which gave us the equivalent of the movement between both of those gave us the equivalent of the timing of a month, and then more micro timing as well, operating within our day to day. And our ancestors didn't just use this because there was nothing else to watch on TV. They did this because they understood that their very survival was connected to it and that they were part of a larger cycle that was operating. These cycles determined whether there was food, whether there was water, when the rainy seasons came. It determined the movement of their animals and food. It also was something that, and if you go back and you look at some of the oldest versions of this, one of them was the markings on a bone marking the lunar cycle, which was later determined, they believe, is connected to marking the moon's for a fertility cycle, which would be very important to our female ancestors. And so I find it really fascinating when we look at astrology from the perspective that it is a timing device. It is something that gives us windows, not only windows of opportunity or auspicious periods within business, but also to help us understand ourselves and our own internal cycles, our own cycles of movement and productivity within our daily lives. And it's these two original luminaries that bring us into our biology, that we are light-driven organisms and that we understand our position not only in the world, but within our day-to-day and within our lives based on these cycles. And they marked our original fuel. And if you think about all life on the planet, without solar energy, without the counterbalance of the moon, there would be no life here. And we're not the only organisms that guide our biological processes by these light cycles. Everything from insects to animals to sea life does. The tides are oriented by these cycles, and we mark our seasons by it, right? So 0 degrees Cancer, astrologically, is always our summer solstice. It is when the sun arrives at 0 degrees Cancer that we have our summer begin. Right, and this marking of those solstices and equinoxes help us to divide our year. And no matter where you're living, in terms of the seasonality, we notice the longer that you live somewhere, even if you're somewhere that doesn't experience more of the gradient of the seasons, that we do in fact actually experience seasonal changes no matter where we're living. It operates and changes the ecosystem of our lives. And so it's been my fascination with this that has driven me to work with both my own biology from an astrological perspective, but those of my clients as well. And the thing that's really interesting is we can go, Vanessa, what does it matter what does astrology have to do with it? Can't we just acknowledge the sun and the moon as being vital to these processes and look at them from an entirely scientific perspective? And the answer to that is yes, but I think we'd be missing a big piece of the puzzle. If we go back and we look at astrology as being the original timing calendars, right? It marked the evolution of the year. Our ancestors understood this. We're going back more than 5,000 years. And various cultures have had some connection to astrology. Astrology and astronomy were not ever separated back then. And for good reason, because it's one thing to understand the science of planets and the solar system and the effect on Earth and the sun cycles and whatnot from a scientific perspective. But as humans, we kind of want to know, what does that mean for us, right? And astrology answers the second question, but it also gives us the timing. So it tells us when those things are going to be unfolding so that we can not necessarily work against our own biology, which we do. This idea of a 9 to 5 or a 40-hour work week was built outside of that, I want to say against the grain of our biology. And it's something that essentially creates a lot of problems, right? Because we expect ourselves to perform and to keep performing and to keep that same steady level of output no matter what, right? It doesn't matter that the seasons have changed. It doesn't matter that we're working with less solar light. It doesn't matter that solar light is not there to feed our mitochondria. It doesn't matter at a societal level. Nobody pays any credence to that. But the problem is that it does affect performance, and it does affect mental health, and it does affect productivity and the quality of the output of the things that we're putting together. And on an overarching level, it also makes us feel really disconnected from life. And so my goal with this podcast, as we kind of go through it, is to bring the science and the astrology, which has been in that sort of social, it's become the social pariah. We can talk about the science, but don't talk about that. I want to merge them together because I believe that, just like Joseph Campbell talked about a lot, our mythology is very important. Our mythology gives meaning and understanding to the cycles that we're in. And so my goal with what I'm here to talk with you about, and thank you for joining me on what is the first episode of Seasonal Year, is to talk about how these light cycles and planetary cycles do impact us both on a more personal basis within the cycles of our life, right? So we go through different eras within our own life, and those are actually marked by planetary cycles. Your natal chart being that sort of fingerprint that gives us that biological markup of how everything works for you, but also something that allows us to work with the ongoing changes that we're experiencing. And if you look at how things are within our society, there's a lot of uncertainty right now. There's a lot of stress. But the one thing that the mythology, the astrology provides is it gives us a context to the times that we're in. And so when you have context to that, you actually experience, and we've just found this, like finding the meaning through in our grief, finding the meaning through different periods and changes within our lives. If we can find the meaning in it, then we aren't resisting it, and we're not under that extreme level of stress, which affects all kinds of things within our health. Your sleep, your relationships, your work productivity, all gets impacted by that if there is no meaning. And we can go and say that meaning is arbitrary, but not to the person who's come to that conclusion for themselves, right? Someone who has lost someone important to them, you can't say that their meaning is arbitrary. And understanding and working with these different phases of your life, these different cycles of your life, is relevant. And so my goal with this podcast is to dive into these themes and to talk a little bit more about them, not just to make you more productive, right? Because that's a byproduct of understanding that your motivation and your fuel level throughout the year changes. So does your focus. And it's not just this generic thing, because everybody experiences this. Your buyers experience this. If you have a business like I do, your buyers are going to go through these behavioral changes based on these cycles. They are seasonal cycles, they are annual cycles, they repeat. We can actually understand what types of offers to put out at specific times because of it, but also the understanding of ourselves and our own energy, the changes of our own motivations. And at a personal level, what astrology brings in is it brings it into your specific life, right? Because there's nobody who has a chart like you. And so as these seasonal changes happen, they're happening within the context of your chart. And your chart has houses which equal areas of life. So we can look at that and say, okay, your focus is going to be here on your family, or your focus is going to be here on your finances, or your focus is going to be here on your relationship, or your focus is going to be here on setting up systems. And so we can look at that and we can know that ahead of time. So some of the things that I want to dive into with these podcasts is the biology of why we work the way that we do, including all of the fascinating studies that have come out and are still coming out about light biology, but also understanding it from a human and life meaning perspective. So how are we working within these different cycles within our lives, the meaning that we give it from a productivity space, why we go into burnout and how to break that cycle, like what is happening there and why that gets recreated. And also the astrology layer. So understanding that this isn't something that's just made up. It's something that has carried our ancestors and us and our world to where it is today, whether we realize it or not. Our calendar system is based off of this mythology, this understanding, this structure of time and our relationship to that time, and how we play this out every year, which is truly fascinating when you look at why do we have back to school season in September or for some places the end of August. Why do we have our new year start in January? It's actually a pretty arbitrary thing to pick that time, and our ancestors would not have necessarily celebrated a new year in that way in the middle of winter. Right? That was the period of energetic recovery. It was not the start of a new year. Why do we have what I'm going to call the second wind of fitness and personal motivational changes that we go through? Why do we have that happen in March and April every year? So there is reasons behind this, and I'm really excited to dive into those. But also, I want to talk about the neurochemistry, because we hear a lot about neurodiversity now in our world, and we're starting to understand that not everybody's brains work the same, which is wonderful that we can make that distinction. But also understanding that these neurochemicals, these neurocascades, they're not islands, right? They don't exist in isolation, and that they can also be mapped not only to the solar cycle, which we'll talk more about. You actually go through periods where we have increased serotonin throughout the year, other periods where we have increased cortisol, other periods where we have increased dopamine, and they are very much tied to the seasonal light cycle. And so it's why you feel more motivated in March and April than you do in November. And why this is something that once we understand it, we stop trying to force ourselves to produce in the same way throughout the year. A good example of this is that there's no fruit-bearing trees that produce year-round, right? They all go through a dormancy period, and then they go back into production again, but they have a cycle for that where they have buds and leaves, and then the seeds of the fruit start, etc. But we are living in a world where that level of production is expected all the time, and the problems that creates. And if we look at the fact that we have a lot of popular books out now, like Cal Newport's Deep Work, for example, the reason that book is so potent and why it's so popular is that we really are longing for quiet, right? We're really longing for the ability to slow down, to have that, I'm thinking Catherine May's book, Wintering, this idea that there is periods within your life that don't necessarily need to come about because something tragic happens, but periods within your life where you long for solitude and you long for things to slow down so that you can do that deeper introspective examination, right? That you can focus on things that take a little bit of time, but they're important to you. And I think that in our world, especially with the advancement of AI and the pressure to continually produce, it's this idea like you have no excuse to not be producing mass amounts of content and achieving great deals of successes within your life, because look at these times that we're living in, right? Unprecedented. But the reality is that we're not meant to be producing all the time. And there is a point where you feel like the well runs dry. But our society looks at that as though there's something wrong with you. And you can potentially lose your job or your relationships or your health or your ways of means of providing for yourself if you take that quiet time. And yet, if we go back through history, these things were actually part of our culture, right? And even in places where, they don't get the traditional winter season, like you look at like Mexico or you look at Spain, for example, they have their siesta, they have their break in the middle of the day. So they have built that rest period in on a day-to-day basis because they don't get it at a seasonal basis in the same way. Yes, they have their rainy seasons and whatnot that goes on there, but it is different, right? So because they get the longer hours of solar light more consistently, they still need the rest, and so they build it into the middle of the day. It's obviously also happens to be the hottest part of the day, which makes sense to rest then. But you just don't, it's a place, those are places where there's a slower pace of life, and maybe they're not in quite as much a rush. But if you look into societies or cultures, areas where we are getting more of the seasonal differences, there's a little bit more of a rush because you're working within tighter time periods where things are going to start to get colder, and so there's going to be less light that we're working with. Some of the things I want to dive into in future issues of this podcast is going to be looking at those neurotransmitter cycles, looking at how the solar light changes throughout the year, diving into what that means for us in terms of the types of actions and motivations that we have, how our productivity changes, because it doesn't mean that you're not productive. It means that your productivity looks different throughout the year. And in order to maintain it, for example, like when we get into end of April into May, for example, right after we have that Aries season astrologically, we move into Taurus season. And that's a period where we tend to have to build in rewards in order to keep ourselves going. And it's not a time where you're going to be starting new routines. So in terms of sales or offers or goals that we're setting for ourselves, understanding that the mechanism during those periods changes. The motivation during those periods changes for your market and for yourself. So what comes next? We're going to talk about a month-by-month map of your biological energy, right? Based on your personal energy and how that changes throughout the year so that you can set the right expectations for your own success. And so that we can also shift away from that blame shame cycle, which is actually what is the kindling behind burnout. And that we can actually start to run our lives and businesses in a way that feels like it nourishes us and feeds us throughout the year. Because if you look at all of nature is built in to do exactly that. Squirrels and chipmunks know when to start hoarding all their nuts. They know that the winter is coming and they plan for it. They don't expect themselves to be out there looking for nuts in December, right? So if you find that you are struggling within your life and your business, we're going to be talking more about that within this podcast. We're also going to be looking at it from a universal layer. What is the sun doing that impacts everyone? That impacts us from a personal layer, so where it's showing up in your life and business. But then also looks at it from a buyer psychology perspective for those of you who have businesses or also are just interested in understanding buyer psychology. So why you take the actions that you do throughout specific times of year. And why do we kind of go through what feels like this stop-start cycle over and over again. The other is that we're going to be looking at these in terms of a little bit more of a formulaic approach, just so that we can understand that there is a timing cycle that's in operation, so you can know what to expect and when. I'm also going to talk about things like modifiers, like Mercury and Mars cycles. And again, if you are not familiar with astrology, note that this is bringing astrology into a biological perspective. And so the goal of it is to make it innate for you. Not something that you have to memorize. It's not something that you have to fully understand astrology for. You live this cycle every year. You live this cycle every month. You live this cycle day to day. You already innately understand it. We're just going to be explaining why it happens that way. And so then we can start to notice these cycles inside of ourselves, so that realizing that they are not some kind of flawed thing within you where you're changing and experiencing these changes throughout the year. They're not because you lost your discipline or you are not consistent enough. The other thing that we're going to talk about is more of a nervous system plan. so that we can get more comfortable with, one, what are some ways that we can improve the use of light within our nervous systems. So our connection to this light and what that looks like, and especially in a very high-tech world where we are flooded with blue light and phones and things that disrupt our biology on every level, how we can lean more into how our bodies naturally operate and support those systems. And I'm also going to be focusing on what I'm going to call special series based on really demand and interest from you and in different, I want to say, cycles of life, right? If you are around age 51 or you're coming up around age 51, one of those cycles is the Chiron return. And that's something, it marks a specific stage of life. And it's something that's very powerful, but it's also fairly testing. So when we come up against that, how do we navigate those periods? Saturn returns, especially if you're having a second Saturn return, right around age 56. That's a period where we kind of go through, sometimes we'll experience empty nest syndrome around that point. If you have children, those children are going off to college and university, and it changes things. You also find that you're entering a different stage of your life. You have aging parents, if they're still with you, and we are re-examining who we are within the context of our life. It's also, sometimes we'll see right around those ages, even around what we say 41, 42 years of age, we'll say, oh, they're having a midlife crisis. Oh no, you're having a Uranus opposition. And Uranus means that you start to buck the system. You start to buck everything that you brought in, like you followed all the rules and you're realizing like, hey, some of these rules aren't working for me. Is that the rule that I want to adhere to? Do I like it? And if I don't, am I willing to kind of shake the boat a little bit? And we care a lot less about what people think of us. So these are timed astrologically, but we, in our society, we look at them like, oh, you're going through a midlife crisis or you're going through empty nest syndrome. Yes, but you're also clearly going through a very specific astrological transit. And I find that those are fascinating to look at. And so I plan to do some special series in here, both from those cycles, as well as some business ones. You might see I have a Substack called Cycles for CEOs, where we talk about how these transits impact us from a business perspective. And so I'll have some special series in here for those of you who are interested from a business perspective. You can listen on into those. So thank you for joining me for this first episode, which I hope to become a really wonderful series where we can have these open discussions about the overlap of these specific themes like aging, running a business, juggling both life and a sense of personal meaning, astrological cycles, brain chemistry, light biology, and how these things come together to create a life and how we can understand ourselves through them. So key is that as a societal level, we have replaced a 10,000-year-old biological system with willpower. And there's a reason that it's fraying at the seams. And I do believe that AI, the advancement of AI, which has its pros and cons, is going to break that wide open, because it creates another question for us to really understand ourselves, is like, if AI can do all this stuff, then what's the point of the human? And where is my meaning within this? And I hope that through this podcast, if you continue to listen, I hope you'll subscribe and share it with people who you think would benefit from it, that we can start to ask those bigger questions. Is what makes us human? Where is our uniqueness and meaning lie within this? And how do we find that in a world that is rapidly changing while also equally remaining the same as it did 10,000 years ago? We have the same biological switches. We are changing and adhere to the same clocks that we did 10,000 years ago. And so how do we work within a world that is sometimes forcibly so, trying to change that biology by having us operate counter to that biology? And how can we work with it and create something that works for us better? And with that being said, thank you for joining me on this first episode of the seasonal year. This has been years in the making, and maybe we could even say 10,000 plus years in the making, of understanding our own biology and sitting at the table with it and having some deeper conversations around what it means to be human. And if this spoke to you, if you felt lit up by some of the conversation that we had here today, I hope that you'll share this with someone who you think would benefit from it, because that's how we grow and that's how I get to do more of this stuff with you. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next cycle.